QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022 presentation, banking section, company section, and shortcuts. Get ready because we bookkeeping pros are moving up the hilltop with QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2022. Here we are in our free sample file, sample rock castle construction. We're going to be opening up the open windows, going to the view drop-down, open windows list, then the company drop-down. Let's open up that home page. And then we'll maximize the home page, and let's concentrate on the home page at this point. So in prior presentations, we've been going by sections, vendor section, customer section, employees. We'll talk about employees later. Now we want to take a look at these items on the right-hand side in the company area and the banking area. To do so, I'm going to close up the tab, but before I do, note we'll also take a look after that at some of the shortcut information we have here. In a future presentation, we'll probably dive into those in a bit more detail. So I'm going to close this window on the left-hand side. Now, I would typically think of these items when I use the home page. I actually use the home page when I'm thinking about the flow type of items typically, because that's just the way I kind of like to visualize it, even though you can find much of the same information in the drop-downs up top, which can be quite useful because if you don't have the home page open, if you're in some other screen and you want to go to the items that are typically in the customers area, the vendors area, or the employees area, or for example, the banking area, in this case, you can go to the drop-down. For the items that are in the company area and the banking area, I usually do use the drop-down, but I want to go over them here because you might like to use them in the home page 1 and 2, because QuickBooks, although they don't fit directly into a cycle, thinks they're going to be important enough to mention. So I think it's good to go over them individually just as a component of the home page. So the first one's going to be the chart of accounts. The chart of accounts is the accounts that we're going to put together that will be used when we enter transactions. All the transactions we enter or forms we enter, which will then create transactions, will have an impact on accounts, at least 2 accounts typically. And that then we need to set up the chart of accounts to do that. That's usually the first thing we do when we set up the company file, often having support from QuickBooks to help us to give us the chart of accounts. So we'll take a look at the chart of accounts in a lot more detail later, but just note that that's obviously quite important, so they put it here. I usually will go to the chart of accounts by going to the lists drop-down and then taking a look at the chart of accounts. The lists drop-down, or the lists term, has become, in essence, a kind of its own terminology within QuickBooks. So there's accounting terminology, in other words, and then QuickBooks terminology can deviate even from accounting terminology. And the lists, just because they happen to house these things under the lists area drop-down, has kind of given us some other terms with regard to what is a list within QuickBooks. And then we've got the inventory adjustments. So if we needed to make an adjustment to the inventory, possibly if we had like a physical count or something like that, we need to adjust the inventory. We have that item here. Then we've got the items and services. That's another one that basically you could think of as the lists, meaning when we purchase, say, inventory, or we make an invoice, then we typically have to bill something, and usually that is done with a service item or inventory item. So when you hear items like service items and inventory items, those are things that we typically will bill, and we're going to have to set those up in order to properly be able to populate our invoices and sales receipts. We also might use those items when we create the bills. Once the items are set up, as we've seen with these forms, the data input can be quite easy. Setting up the items can be a little bit more difficult. This is another area where I wouldn't normally go from the home page, but typically it's another item under the lists. These being the primary 2 items there. You go to the item lists. That's where I would typically go to find those items. Order checks. This is going to be something that if we're actually physically printing the checks out of the QuickBooks system, we would have to buy the physical checks. And that's just the way it has to be. You can't print a check on a blank piece of paper. So you got to buy the physical checks and then enter the checks, so you can go through that process there. Turn on time tracking, which is a feature within QuickBooks that can help us to track the time and then use that time that is tracked either to do the payroll information and or enter that time tracking if we set it up as a billable item to be billed in the invoices, for example, and the sales receipts, possibly. Your calendar. So you got your calendar information in the company area. And then in the banking area, we have then the deposit. The deposit is a major type of form that you can think of as a data input form. So it's still kind of being indicated that it's in like the data input forms on the left-hand side, but it's not really part of any individual cycle as we talked about before, although we would hope that most of the deposits are coming from customers, and therefore it's kind of indicated that it's part of the customer's area. But we could have deposits that are from other types of things, like we might be putting money in as an owner deposit into the company, or we might have a loan or something like that that's going into the company. So those type of things, we could still use this deposit form, although I typically only use this deposit form on the income state on the home page, or this deposit here, if I'm going through a cycle where I have it coming out of undeposited funds, meaning I created a sales receipt to undeposited funds, or create sales receipt, or receive payment, I should say, or sales receipt. That number 2 would indicate that there's 2 items basically in undeposited funds. If I'm doing some other kind of deposit, I'll typically go straight to the register and enter it into the register oftentimes. The reconciliation process, this isn't a data input form, but more kind of like a function that we need to do. It's the primary internal control other than or beyond simply the double entry accounting system, us being in balance, which is forced to happen by simply using QuickBooks. So using QuickBooks is a huge internal control over and above doing the books by hand if you're not using a double entry accounting system by hand, because it forces you to be in balance. Also then on top of that, if you can compare your books to what has happened in the bank, that's another layer of internal control, huge internal control, something that small companies to large companies should all do. And they put that here. And I usually wouldn't go to it here. I'd usually go to it by going to the banking dropdown and then reconcile. But that's an important item here. So they put it here. So we got the check forms. Note the check forms, you would think they'd kind of put up in the vendor section somewhere, because that means we're paying people. But like with the deposits, it's not something that necessarily means we're paying a vendor. We might be paying off a loan, or like the bank, or we might be paying ourselves with regards to giving us a draw, noting that that check form does not just represent writing a physical check, but anything that's decreasing the checking account directly. Then we have the check register. That's going to be like that check register format that you can enter directly, which I think is easier to enter things like checks and say the deposits when they're not tied to something else. So if I have a deposit not tied to a received payment or sales receipt, then I would go to the register, enter it directly. If I have a check that is not tied to a bill or part of a sales tax widget payment or part of a payroll tax form, then I might enter that directly into the register. It could be easier. Print checks, so when you if you are actually printing the checks, you might then enter the checks and then say that you want them to be printed, and then get your physical checks that you got from the bank, put them in the printer in the proper ordering, and then you can print the checks at one point in time here, assigning out the proper number for the check numbers. Then you got the enter credit card charges. The credit card charges you can enter in a similar way. In a full service accounting system, what you would like to do is record the charges on the credit card as you make the charges, and then reconcile the credit card to the credit card statement, meaning we enter the transactions into the system on our side as we make them, and then we check that with a reconciliation process to the credit card statement. Now in practice, a lot of people kind of wait. Because they're electronic transfers with the credit cards. There may not do, small companies often basically kind of depend on the charges clearing, and so they basically depend on, in essence, the bank or the financial institution to enter the credit cards. But it's the same process. You should, or you would have more internal control. You don't have to, but you'd have more internal control if you entered the charges when you made them and then check them to the bank. It's the same with the checks here. If you make a lot of electronic transfers, you might be more likely to just depend on the bank feeds. Like you can do that same, depend on the bank feeds with the financial institution for the credit card too. But if you wanted to have more kind of internal control, you'd want to record the transactions even if they're being made electronically. So it's a matter of time versus reward kind of situation there. So those are going to be those main 2 items. Then if I open up the window on the left-hand side, You'll recall we've got the open windows here that I've been typically using, and then I kind of minimized these items down below. So let's take a quick look at these items down below and look at these shortcuts. We might go into the shortcuts in a little bit more detail later, but let's just see what they have in the shortcuts, because these are items that, once again, QuickBooks kind of emphasizes by already putting them in the shortcuts. You can customize the shortcuts then at a later point and make different changes to them if you so choose. But of course, they have the home page and the shortcut, which you could find with the company drop-down homepage. I typically, because I work on a fairly large screen desktop most of the time, am happy with the drop-downs. I like to have the homepage open. I like to have the open windows open over here, toggle between the open windows, and then toggle between the drop-downs up top to basically find everything I need. But if you like to put something in the shortcut, you can then customize the shortcuts on the left. Just note also it's similar to like if you use Microsoft Word or Excel and you really like shortcuts and you make a whole thing of your own system of a bunch of shortcuts that is in your own system. There's kind of a problem with that if you try to train somebody else, because then now you're completely reliant on your own kind of shortcut system. So I like some shortcuts I use a lot if it's too burdensome for me to go to the drop down. Otherwise, I kind of like knowing where it is on the drop down, partially because I do these presentations, right? If I just did my own work, maybe I can make my workflow faster by using shortcuts more often. But pros and cons of the shortcuts. Then you've got the My Company information. So that's going to take you to the company information directly, which you might need, for the phone number and your email and whatnot. The EIN number might be something you need to get to quickly. And then we've got the income tax tracker. I'm sorry, not the income tax tracker, the income tracker. And that gives you a nice little breakout between your estimates, your time and expenses, your open invoices, and your overdue information in a similar fashion as you sort through kind of like the bank feed. And you can get a nice little sorting window, and you could sort that differently here. We got the bill tracker. So you have a similar situation with the purchase orders that you would send out that you have not yet received. You got the open bills, and then you've got the overdue bills sorted in a nice bill tracker type of format. And then we have the calendar. They got the calendar that they're going to put here, which they also put on the home page. So the calendar can help us track the information. We have the snapshot information on the left-hand side. Take a look at the snapshot. So that gives us a nice little overview and some of the graphs and whatnot, a more pictorial type of view on the snapshot. Income and expenses, previous year income comparison, customers who owe money information, accounts. So we've got those. Most of that information, of course, you can find if you were going to run the reports and so on. Then we've got the customers, taking us to the customer center. That seems like something you don't really need to me, because you could find that in the drop down by going to the customer center, and it's the first one. So it seems a little bit redundant to me to find the customers. I would, if I was going to use this a lot, remove that item. The vendors, same thing. The vendors is pretty clearly right under the vendor section on the first drop down. So I would use the drop downs when it's simple to do so. Employees, same thing, because the employees would be in the employees section. Drop down, the employee center is the first item. So that's not something that would be entirely or really useful to me. The documents, if you're uploading the documents, this could be useful if you're using the information, you're attaching documents a lot to your system as you're recording transactions and you're attaching the documents to them. The reports, this takes us to the reports center. Also seems a little bit redundant, not very useful to me, because you can find the reports in this nice drop down. Go to the reports center. That's the first one up top too. And then we've got the order checks, which we saw before, which was on the home page. It doesn't seem particularly useful to me. User license information, if you need to add more users, doesn't seem like you're going to do that all the time. So I don't see like you really want a shortcut, because that's not something you're doing on a daily basis. You got an invoice. You make the invoices all the time, but there's a whole bunch of different ways you can get to the invoice. I would go to the the customer drop down and create the invoice from the customer drop down typically. The items here, inventory items, that to me is a list item. And I would remember it as a list, because not only are they found under the lists drop downs, but they're also termed and referenced to in practice by QuickBooks users as a list oftentimes. So you might want to I would learn that. The check form could be fairly easily found by going under the banking transaction. If I was actually going to write a check, then I probably wouldn't do it that way anyways, because if it's not connected to something else, I'd probably go into the register. And so it's not too helpful for me. The bill can generally be found on the home page, as we saw, or in the vendor section. So we'd enter a bill. So I wouldn't use this one generally. And then we've got the register. The register can be found a couple different areas, but you could find it in the banking dropdown and use register. So that one isn't that helpful to me, it seems to me. And then you've got your chart of accounts. That's the major list dropdown, which I would remember as a list, and I'd like to remind that by using the lists dropdown. So that, and then you got your reminders. That might be useful if you've got your customized reminders that you're using all the time. And then the find area, and so you've got your advanced find. Maybe if you're doing advanced finds, that could be nice to know where it's at. And then the feedback, services, add payroll, that's kind of an add-on that you can add, and credit card information in the shortcuts. One more thing to just realize is you've got your favorites up top as well. So you got your shortcuts on the left-hand side that you could basically customize. And then your other option that you can think about is customizing your favorite options. And so this drop down itself might be something that you can put down the few things that you think are your most common transactions. You could customize it by going to customize, and then you would add the transaction or add the items that you want. You can have much the same kind of things or options that you can choose on the left and add them over here. As you add them, they will appear in your favorites drop down. That's another way to customize it. My general feeling, though, as I'm repeating it a couple times, is that you don't want to over-customize typically. If there's something that is buried somewhere and you're saying, hey, that's a little bit difficult to get to, I would customize it. If you're customizing things just because you use them a lot and yet they're pretty clearly easily found within the drop-downs, even though you haven't kind of memorized it, like the chart of accounts or the items or like to the vendor center or something like that, I would try to remember how QuickBooks does it, because that'll really help you to communicate with other people as you're training other people, or as other people are trying to help you out navigating through certain things.